Hello, it's Writing Wednesday. Um, it is the end of May, uh, 2018, and I'm a little late. Didn't sleep well last night, so tuning in slightly late. Thank you for hanging in with me, and or if you're coming to us later on, that's groovy too. So, um, it's been quite a week. A lot of family stuff, and just opens you up. It just opens everything up. And I thought I'd talk today about get back to some nuts and bolts writing tips for you. And I thought today we would talk about scene and story, which is those are the building blocks of your piece, whether it's going to be a short story or a novel. The scene. Nobody writes a novel. People write a scene, and then they write another scene, and they write another scene. Some people just think the idea of writing a novel is overwhelming. Well, if you realize that nobody writes a novel, you just write a scene, then think about the content of the scene, what you're going to write in this piece, make it internally coherent, and then the next one will take care of itself. And you'll ask the same questions and you'll do the same things. But I'd like to start with scene, which is so it's the smallest building block, and then story is the overall. Your overall, I hate the word arc, I hate all that jargony stuff, but your overall narrative. But if you learn about what makes a good scene, you'll also have some idea of what is going to make a good story. Well, what's a scene? If you were in a class, of course, I'd ask you. So those of you who are watching, what's a scene? Anybody want to give that a try? Well, you can think of it as a unit of action, which means all narrative, all drama works within that unit. It's the equivalent of a paragraph in an essay. You're making that point at that time, and then you'll make another point, and they'll start to link together, and the essay would be your story. Now, it's a unit of action, so it has a beginning, a middle, and end to a scene. And the first person who thought deeply about scene was Aristotle, in his book, The Poetics. And he determined what was necessary for a scene. And there are two they call them the Aristotelian unities, two essentials for a scene: time and place. So a scene happens at a certain time, in a certain place. One time, one place, one scene. And as we discussed before when we talked about landscape, so many people don't set their work anywhere in particular. So you have people kind of swimming around in undescribed nowhere land. They kind of swim up to each other, and then they have their dialogue. They kind of swim away. And we talked about the importance of setting a believable landscape, creating a believable landscape, and putting your characters then, well, if scene is the unity of time and place, you can see the importance of place. You have to set it somewhere. And then something happens in that place that is creating the scene. And if you end the unit of action in the same place before you move on. So it was one of the things I saw a lot when I was teaching. This is at graduate level. not just beginners, but you see it up and down the ladder of experience. That so many people, usually it's a less experienced writer problem, where you see it in the student writing where they go to a party and nothing much is happening, and they smoke a bowl, and then they go on to the next party, and then they hang out, and then they have some wine and maybe make out with someone, and then they move to the next party, and and nothing happens. And when you tell the student that, they go, well, they met June and they had a bowl and they danced, and yes, but nothing actually happened. And you ended the scene before anything happened. You move to the next place. So each place is a different scene. So stop and have a scene before you move on. Be really careful about this tendency to use space instead of having a scene. When I was learning to write, I would read books about writing because I didn't go to school for this. And it would say, you need conflict. You need conflict. So I thought conflict was people yelling at each other. It means you engage somehow. Each scene has characters engaged in a struggle, and it could be a very subtle struggle with other characters. It could be a big one. And something happens in that scene. There's a change in that, by means of that conflict, putting pressure on those characters, something happens. And it's that change that makes the scene. So when I teach this, I use the symbol, little triangle symbol, which is the chemical, if you've taken chemistry, that it's the delta, which indicates change. So a scene is something changes for your protagonist. That's why work that is not quite developed often has a plural protagonist. We went here, we went there, we did this, we thought that. And the difficulty with that is who's going to have the change. You're not going to have a group having a change. So, in character-driven work, you have a protagonist, and they're the agent they're the recipient of change, or they're the arena of change, their own psyche. So you're in a situation, your character's in a situation where some kind of pressure comes to bear on them. And the change that happens in the scene is perhaps they learn something they didn't know before, and they change, or perhaps an antagonist, somebody is putting pressure on them, and they can either win or lose. They can. The important thing is that a scene is a one-way door. You can go into the scene, but you have to come out the other way. You can't go back to the way it was before. If you can go back to the way it was before after that scene, you don't need the scene. If you have a big yak fest with somebody and everybody comes out of it thinking the same thing and being exactly the same person, you don't need the scene at all. So always ask yourself, what is the scene about? And if nothing's happening, get rid of it. You don't need it. So think a rule of thumb about scene is if your character comes in one mood and leaves in the same mood, you don't need the scene because nothing happened. You can always check to see if you used the scene. Your character comes in a crappy mood and leaves feeling hopeful, you have a scene. You've somehow created a scene that caused a change in your character. If the character comes in snotty and ironic and leaves snotty and ironic, you don't need the scene. That's why a lot of work of groovy, hip young people can be so tedious because nobody changes, that nobody is affected by things. That's a tough protagonist. And it causes a very, it sounds very snappy and hip, and sort of the dialogue can be fun. But it's all one note, and it just doesn't go anywhere. And then you find yourself tearing your hair. Why isn't this going anywhere? Well, it's not going anywhere because your character is too cool for school and everything just rolls off of them. That's not a good protagonist. You need a protagonist who is able to change, is able to be affected by things, who loses sometimes, who can come in hopeful and be squashed, who can come in ironic and be squashed. That's a good scene. So watch out moving your character around too much. I used to think action, dramatic action is what you need, right, in a book. So my action, so I'd have them, driving around in car chase, whatever, not car chases, but driving around too much, going to too many parties. I did it myself. And, it took a little bit of discipline to stay in the room. Your character always wants to leave the room, always wants to leave the party because there's pressure on them. And that is the writer. That's the writer wanting to leave the room. It's too much pressure on us, and we cut the scene short so we can leave the room. Don't leave the room. Keep them in there until there's a victor, until something happens. Has anybody ever gone crabbing? You put a crab pot in the water and you put a dead fish in there. And it's like a basketball net that's closed at the top. And the crabs can go in, but they can't get out again. You want your characters to have to go through the scene. They don't get to just hang out or come back out. If your protagonist is someone who has a personality disorder and is incapable of change, that's not a good protagonist. That protagonist is not going to help you push that. You're going to have to push that train up the hill. Protagonist is not going to push that train up the hill. Often, if somebody has a character disorder, it's better to give them to pick a different protagonist to tell their story. That's a tough one because there's no change. It's more of a poem than fiction, narrative fiction. So scene, you're always going to be working as scenes, and the important thing to know is that you shouldn't reset. It's not Groundhog Day. You don't go back and you're suddenly back in that same, you came in ironic, you're squashed, and in the next scene you're ironic again. There's got to be a forward movement. And we call that conflict. We've talked about conflict before. It's when two forces are brought into play against each other and something happens. Something changed. One person wanted one thing and somebody wanted another, and they put pressure on each other and one won. There was an outcome. So you tell stories with scenes. Now, conflict. Let's talk about conflict. I teach at the Squaw Valley community of writers in the summertime. Not this summer. You usually teach every other, so I'm off this summer. But it's a great program. I love them. But I was teaching this, and I had a participant ask me if there can be a story without conflict. They don't want conflict. They don't like conflict. Everybody's read stories or novels that there is no conflict, and that is like pretty dull stuff, where every punch is pulled and nobody gets a big boo-boo. It's like, I find that not very, generally not very interesting, but I thought about it. Can there be a story without conflict? If there is no tension between the protagonist, environment, other people, or within themselves. There's no forward movement. They just kind of wander around. And if there can be tension but no movement, so you can have these scenes of conflict, but if there is no change from one emotional state to another, if there's no movement, then there's also no story. There's just tension. So what you want is them to come in one mood, leave in another. And if you've achieved that, you've gotten some kind of conflict, some kind of outcome. And keep moving keep a variety in the settings, in the time. If you have, if your scene, this last scene was outdoors at midnight, the next scene should be maybe indoors during the daytime. So vary up your locations, vary up your time of day. That is very helpful for scene. So conflict. How do you have a scene with a story without conflict? Scenes without conflict. So I was talking to that person about a character who never experiences conflict with the world that they want as a protagonist. Can that happen? And I can think of characters, protagonists who make trouble for everyone else, and they're perfectly fine. You can have like a Mr. Magoo type of character who he is fine, and then everybody else experiences the fallout. That's interesting. A book like Auntie Mame, she was not the protagonist of that book. Her nephew was the protagonist because he was the one who had the change. But she was certainly somebody who would make havoc, and then everybody else has to clean it up. So often the protagonist would be one of the people who has to clean it up. And conventionally, there's three kinds of conflict. Man against nature, man against man, man against himself. But generally, it's all man against himself, because even if somebody is giving you a hard time, it causes conflict inside. Let's see. We got some good thoughts here. Good questions. So this is talking about the the protagonist who has no change. You can show their inner process, but it's very difficult to have most of the scenes will resemble one another if there's no progress in the protagonist. So even somebody who's mentally ill should be progressing through their story if they're the protagonist. If they're the antagonist, you can do whatever you like with them. Protagonists are about repeatability, said Alicia. You can't say that a particular character is a bad protagonist because that inner conflict without being shown on the surface. As long as their growth one way or the other is told, the story can still be told. Yep. The bad protagonist is the protagonist who doesn't react, who doesn't take anything in, who doesn't help the reader with his own needs and his desire to progress, his desire to achieve his aims, if it's only to maintain personal dignity, survival. A bad protagonist is just a protagonist who comes into a scene and leaves in the same emotional state, when they cannot be, when pressure can't be put on them. Not a good protagonist. Doesn't help you. you'll find yourself doing a lot more work than you wanted to. Relatability was what she meant. Yeah, okay. Their relatability. I think if they're interesting, it doesn't, people find their way to relate. If you even have Humbert Humbert, who's just god awful, but he's so funny, and his view of things, his way of describing things, is so wonderful. And his conflict is to try to get what he wants and not be waylaid by others. He's easily frustrated. That's very funny. So anyway, we want variety in rhythm of the scenes, the orchestration of scenes, how many characters. If you have a scene that's one character dealing with something, in the next scene you might want to have a group of people. In the next scene you might want to have 3 people. In the next scene you want to have 2. It's kind of like an opera. You want to have your solos and your duets and your trios and your full chorus and mix them up. So let's see, what else? So that's the basics of scene. And if it's pretty simple. You can read whole books about it, but we're not about reading whole books here on Writing Wednesday. We're here about rules of thumb and tips. And I've just basically, given you the keys to the door here. If you just make sure that something happens in one time, one place, one scene, unit of action, you'll have it down. I like to read, when I teach this, I often use thrillers for an example of how to write a scene and watch that change happen, because like fruit flies, their genes are so big. The movement is so big. You can't miss it. And my favorite way of teaching that is the James Bond novel From Russia with Love, which I love. And if you go to the scene where Comrade Romanova, Tatiana, is brought in to Colonel Klebb. If everybody has seen this movie, you'll recognize this. It's a great scene. It's pulp, but it is wonderful. And you can watch how Rosa Klebb breaks down Tatiana, who comes in thinking she's going to deal with this and kind of pulls herself together. And you watch Rosa Klebb working on this girl, and you can see the change where she comes to realize. First she's terrified, but she's going to, hang in there. And then you see how the conflict works to the point where Tatiana recognizes that there's no way out of this situation, that she is going to have to do exactly what Rosa Klebb wants. And the way Ian Fleming handles that scene, where you see that you can watch that change happening, that is a really, really good book to take out of the library if you don't have it, and see how that scene works. It's chapter 9, called A Labor of Love. So I highly recommend that. So let's talk about story. So there's scene in a nutshell. And go ahead and ask anything that you would like. Okay. So story. Story is a little bit... story is one of our major hurdles, obviously, in writing fiction. How to take inner conflicts makes us want to write, and couch them in a narrative that will help another person walk through that emotion, what will hold it. Story has that movement that we're talking about. So you imagine a series of scenes. A short story might have 3 scenes. A novel might have hundreds of scenes. And they're each a little building block because they're each that little increment of change as the character is developing. But let's look at the overall idea. Now, if you're like me, God forbid, I write, and often I don't know what the hell is going on. I'm really crawling along under the barbed wire, just following some emotion, some feeling, something about the character. And then I'll make a total mess, and I'll ask myself, well, what the hell was that about? I don't know. You start asking yourself questions. What the hell is this about? And there are different ways to look at story. There are several different ways to look at story. Now, I write character-driven fiction, so there's a certain way that I look at story. But let's start with the simplest. The simplest is cause and effect. Okay, cause and effect. This is classic. This is, I think, E.M. Forster from aspects of the novel. The king died and then the queen died is not a story. And then is not a story. A story has a spring to it. The story has an inner cohesion. So the king died. When you have a kid who tells you a story, the king died, the queen died, and then when we had ice cream, and then I watched, the Power Rangers, and then we went to grandma's, and, there's just a string of events that is not story. And I'm sure we've all read, books, hopefully, if they got published, but we've definitely read manuscripts that's not, it's just and then. It's why people have such a hard time listening to kids tell a story, because there's no sense of building something. It's just stringing something. So we're always trying to build something when we're building a story. So what Forster would say is the king died and then the queen died. That's not a story, but the king died and the queen died of sorrow is a story. Cause and effect. So that's what you're looking for, is cause and effect, and it could be a string, obviously, of causes and effects that build your story. So you can also call it setup and payoff. Many people prefer that nomenclature. Setup and payoff. So the fundamental aspect of all storytelling is setup and payoff. A joke has a setup and a payoff. A shaggy dog story. What's a shaggy dog story? It's where you go on and on and on with the setup, and then the payoff is extremely minor, if there is a payoff at all. So it's a joke on the listener, and the listener then proceeds to take their fingers and just wring your neck with that. So in most, if not all stories, the setup is a small percentage of the story. It's mostly payoff, payoff, payoff. The setup is just the beginning, the pressure being put on a situation, and then the rest of the book is seeing where that goes. And when I used to be a typesetter, and one of the things I used to do is set the little TV guides in the paper, where you take the movie is coming up and you try to describe it in a sentence, and that was really, really good practice. And I noticed how they were able to describe a whole story in one sentence. So a Kansas girl is transported to a magical world. That's the setup. And then the payoff is, and learns there's no place like home, right? Setup and payoff. Her flying away is the cause, and when she gets there, that's the effect of having to get home and all the other things that happen. So the payoff eventually is that she learns there's no place like home. Or here, how's this? An angry orphan girl in the 19th century is sent to live with her crippled cousin on a bleak Yorkshire estate. There it is. That's the setup of the story. And usually in the TV guide, that's all you get. What's the payoff of that setup is she learns the importance of love. And the story is all the ways that she thinks she has to go through to learn that. How about this? It's a woman astronaut learns her truth strengths when the ship is taken over by an alien. Recognize that? So the setup is the woman and her ship taken over by aliens. And the payoff is that she learns her strength in the battles that make her learn it, right? So if you don't learn anything else today about story, think about setup and payoff. So we'll take a closer look at the causes and effects. So the first element, the cause, the setup, could be called the problem. The problem gives birth to the need. I mean, this is really fruit fly stuff, okay? So commercials are a perfect way to see this. They're like the smallest little story. Person has a problem. I have to put all these boxes away, but oh, my aching back, which gives rise to a need. What does the character want? Pain relief, right? So that motivates you into the action of the story. How is he going to deal with the, oh, my aching back? What do you do about back pain, Doug? So trying to get the answer to the need, right? He's asking his comrade. They tell him, I take a Motrin and a good slug of Stoli. That's what I wrote here. I'll try it. So that's the action, problem, need, action, as the person tries to solve their problem. Then it's what he learns, illumination. He does it, and it really works. It's the change in your mind, the illumination moment. And then usually there's a little wrap-up showing the result of the illumination. We see him lifting the boxes. Thanks, Don. Right. So setup has a problem and a need. And payoff, there's action, illumination, and wrap-up. So this is called 5-step story structure. Very, this is like real basic stuff. And as an exercise, you might want to do a commercial yourself using that 5-step story structure. Let's see. But for me, so here's an example of using this story structure. You can see it's not particularly a character-driven structure, so it works more for thrillers and stuff like that. But it's a basic thing you might enjoy. Problem, I've got an alien on board. Need, I have to get rid of it. Action, bam, boom, traps, arguments with crew members, deaths, illumination. I take it upon myself to kill it. There's no one but me. I'm it. And then the wrap up is I kill it. Problem, my girlfriend wants to break up with me. Need, to make her want to be with me. Action, I try everything in the book to make her want me. Illumination, I'm a jerk. No wonder she doesn't want to be with me. Wrap up, I get the girl, or I let the girl go. So the illumination is what all of this storytelling is looking for. So another good, the illumination is where the little delta comes in. That's where the change comes in. So the illumination is the heart of it. And if you want an exercise, do 5 stories, just, on that simple, single line level of 5-step story structure. But what I do is I write character-driven stories, which means the action comes out of who the character is and what their specific problem is. So the 5-step story structure can work really for anybody. definitely for actioners where people don't care all that much of, what the person's deep underlying problems are. But I like stories that are about people's deep underlying problems. So, and oh, my cat is yowling. Well, tough. Too bad, kitty. Too bad. But the character-driven story structure I think of as the XYZ structure. And the way it works is when character X, with all of their, yeah, that is my cat, Milo. I'm sure he'll make an appearance quickly. Yeah, they, character X doesn't mean their name. X is a collection of personality traits. So when character X with these certain personality traits, good and bad, finds themselves in situation Y. In situation Y, this is the setup. Situation Y is a situation that is going to put pressure on those characteristics. When character X finds himself in situation Y, Z happens. And Z is that illumination, what they learn about themselves or the world. So, and that Z, that illumination moment can be called the theme, but we don't care about that because you're not looking to write an essay about the writing of your story. You just want to get into the heart of it. So when character X finds himself in situation Y, Z happens. So we have, say, Alien. Let's look at Alien again. Character X is this first mate, or whatever she is, first mate. And she has a bunch of characteristics. She's, clever, and she's resourceful, and blah, 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 blah. And she's very, very loyal. And she's a terrific crew member. She's a terrific mate. But the situation Y happens with all this, attack on the ship by this alien, and one by one everybody's getting killed. And she's still very loyal. She's still looking for someone to tell her how to deal with this. But Z, what happens is that she realizes that she no longer can count on anybody else to decide, anyone else to figure this out, anyone else to fight it out, that she has to pick up the leadership role, which she was not intending to do, and fight her way through this and succeed. So it's not the killing of the alien that happens. It's the realization, I have to be the leader here. So XYZ. Let's say the orphan who goes to live with her uncle and crippled cousin in Yorkshire. This is The Secret Garden. The X is this little orphan who's really angry, who is, her parents are dead. She's shipped back from India where she was a princess. Now she's just sort of a ward of the court type of thing in this family. And this crippled cousin really pisses her off because he's so spoiled. Well, she's so spoiled too. So she's like looking at her mirror image. And then that puts pressure on that spoiled kid. And the rest of it is wrestling with that anger at the death of her parents, and her attitude, and her being so spoiled herself, and realizing there's more to life than just having everybody cater to you. And she begins to let go of some of the tougher aspects of her personality, some of her anger, some of her, fury, and making friends with, local kids, actually making friends with her cousin. So Z happens when she realizes that she does have a family and she does have people who care about her. And that there's still a possibility for love in the world. So think about story. Think about when you've made a mess of your story. Because X, what happens is under the pressure of Y, the action of the story is how a person's characteristics either hold steady under that pressure and which of them flip. You know, the bitter orphan girl stops being so bitter. She's still spunky, though. She's still a strong person. She's still, has a bit of fight in her. That helps her. But the bitterness doesn't help her and has to flip if she's going to realize the Z, if she's going to make her change. So when you've made a mess of your story, you can step back and go, okay, X, Y, Z. Who is the character? If you notice your character is like, a super anxious person. But the payoff has nothing to do with their anxiety. The payoff might have to do with compassion. So you realize that your character orchestration is off, that you need to change your character. You either change character X, so it aligns with compassion. They either have to be, their lack of compassion has to be a salient characteristic, or you have to change the payoff to go with the anxiety. So there's an orchestration between setup and payoff. And sometimes when your story's not working, it's because your orchestration is off. Your setup is different. You're setting up something within the characters' conflicts, their internal conflicts. You're setting up something that you're not paying off. So you have to decide which to, choose one and fix the other. And we talk more about orchestration. We've talked about character, so I talked about character orchestration. That if you have a character who's up against a very strong antagonist, you have to make sure that they're maybe not quite as strong as the antagonist, but they have to be able to withstand what's happening, or they just will drop the ball, and you'll be pushing the train up the hill. You don't want that. So the character themselves, so you can already see why people say character is story, because the character carries the ingredients of the story, the potential of the story that's released when you put them in a situation that's exactly designed to step on their toes. If somebody's afraid of bees, you throw them in a room with bees. That's character and situation aligning. So it's what the Greeks talked about when they talked about a character's fatal flaw, which in Greek drama was usually hubris, which is pride. They usually challenge the gods. Not a good thing to do. And the realization of their powerlessness before fate is generally what happens in a Greek tragedy. It's that realization, that Z moment, where they realize, wow, I had no control over this. I thought I knew everything. I had great, sense of myself. And boy, did I drag this down on my own head. That's a Greek tragedy. And they're destroyed. So most of Greek drama is pride goeth before a fall. Very simple, but but huge. So think about movies and try to do XYZ with their stories. Try Wizard of Oz. Try Gone with the Wind. Try Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. Try Medea, Long Day's Journey into Night, Streetcar Named Desire. You really can start seeing how the characters are creating, how that XYZ structure works. Really helpful in a very, simple way. Sometimes you're telling a story from the wrong point of view. We talked a little bit about point of view. That if you have a story like, do you remember There Will Be Blood? Your protagonist doesn't change at all, the father, just dastardly from the word go. That the true protagonist of, I mean, that movie did very well. I don't mean to shit on it, but I came out of there going that it was told from the wrong point of view, that the son, the cherished son, who is deafened by a blast drilling for oil, which is what the father's monomaniacal thing is, and then the son the father rejects the son because now he is inferior. Now he's disabled, and that's not the son that he wanted. But the son goes from adoring the father to being the victim of the father to rejecting the father. The son is the protagonist of that story, not the father. Slumdog Millionaire, who makes the change? The brother, right? The criminal brother who, no spoilers, but dies protecting his brother, who doesn't change at all. He's a hopeful, optimistic guy from beginning to end. The brother, however, changes. So he's the secret protagonist of that. And I would have liked it been the brother's story. If it was character-driven, it would have been the brother's story. Often people, when you have problems with your story, you're often picking the wrong protagonist. You're often using the wrong character as protagonist. So if you notice you're having problems writing it, think about, is another character the protagonist? Does this guy change, or is there somebody else who changes that would be a better protagonist for me? The Great Gatsby. Jay Gatsby is not the protagonist of that story, right? Okay. So looking at movies, you can do that. Let's talk about what is melodrama. When we're talking about story, we should talk about melodrama. Melodrama is unearned emotion. Where you haven't set it up so that we are feeling the full depth of a tragedy or the impact of a large event. You're just telling us, oh, suddenly, and it's under preparation of the reader for the event, which is why it's very difficult to have a murder in a short story unless you begin with the murder. That the murder is just the time, is part of the setup. Because you don't have enough space to really prepare for an action that large in a short story, which everything I say will have exceptions. And if you can see when I'm saying this is, you don't have room for it, if you want to do it anyway, just know that that is something that is really a problem. So you just have to write really aware of the pitfall. Yes, Kitty. So melodrama, you can't earn a murder. You can't earn something that big in a short story. So watch your big drama. Like, I like big drama. So, but when you're writing in a short story, be careful of taking too big an action that people are told that they should care about, but it's just they can't because you haven't earned it. You haven't gotten there yet. Okay, well, I think that you've just gotten all you need, really, to go and look at your stuff and say, do I have a story? Do I have, what about my XYZ? Do I have scenes? Do I have real scenes that have an emotional change? And if there's no change in the protagonist, away they go. Try to avoid stopping in moving out of place and continuing a scene somewhere else. Try to stay where you are, finish the scene there before moving out, moving on. Here are some exercises that you might want to use. Take 2 classic short stories. Some people have used, in my classes, some of the stories that have been used were Chekhov's Lady with Lapdog, Kate Chopin's A Respectable Woman, Scott Fitzgerald's Winter Dreams, Ernest Hemingway, Big Two-Hearted River, James Joyce, A Painful Case, Jack London, To Build a Fire. Those are just some of the stories that people have used to do this XYZ format. And then analyze them. Highlight the clues and aspects that show us who character X is, what their characteristics are. You can underline or highlight them, and then in the margin you can say compassion. He pets the dog. He takes the ice out of the dog's paws or whatever. Compassion. So you get those bits of character traits, write those qualities, their clues in the margins. They're not story points. Often people will underline story points instead. That's not what we're doing. Character X. Then circle the illumination moment when they realize what has been played out or what is going on, where the change kind of comes to the surface. And then write it up in XYZ format. When character X, with thus and so characteristics, finds himself in situation Y, what that situation is, it's going to put pressure, he comes to understand Z about himself or the world, or both. So try to use dead writers, because there's so much experimental writing that doesn't work in this way. So many things that really aren't character-driven. Avoid O. Henry endings, trick endings, because those are not character-driven stories. We don't really know who those people are. And then the other thing is, if you do not use classic stories, if you want to use modernist work, experimental work that aren't character-driven, analyze it and decide how it does work. If it doesn't use this kind of character-driven story machine, engine, what is the engine? How does it work? And really apply your analytical skills. In the absence of character-driven plot, what gives the story its shape, its feeling of completion? Other stories people used in classes of mine are Hemingway's Summer People, Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, John Updike's A and P. I would say Cheever's story, is it the 7:15? It's about a train. It has a time as the title. I'm trying to remember what it was. Edith Wharton's The Other Two, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, Franz Kafka's A Country Doctor, Chekhov's The Darling, and unfortunately the woman doesn't change, but the reader has the realization. So that's a different way to tell the story. Misery, The Kiss, those are Chekhov. Ralph Ellison's King of the Bingo Game, but think about the realization. That's an interesting one. Somerset Maugham's A String of Beads. Catherine Ann Porter's Theft. Guy de Maupassant's The Necklace. These are all good stories to practice on. And let's see, for scene, let's see what exercises might be worthy of your time and effort. Scenes. One of the things I've done with for exercise to do an exercise with theme is to work with the 5 major emotions. These are, so say the 5 major emotions: joy, terror. Well, I do 4 major emotions: joy, terror, sadness / grief, anger. And then create a situation of one of these moods: a who, a when, a where. And really get in there, really set this up. Now have something take place where the emotion changes to one of the other major emotions. And so just do that as an exercise. So, you don't have to use something that you're actually working. This is the cat who always walks on my desk when he wants something. Say hi. Hi, Marlo. Hi, I'm a pill. So have something take place where the emotion changes to one of the other major emotions, and take about 20 minutes for that. Don't over-labor it. So that's a good one to start with. And hope you enjoyed the story and scene. And let's see if there's anything else. The July workshop at Esalen. Whoa! The July workshop at Esalen, yes, is I believe is still open. Do you find endings are the hardest? I find endings impossible. Endings, if you know your story, if you understand what character X has to change under the circumstances, your stories will become easier because the character will draw them out. The very endings are always hard because that's the chime that the reader is left with. So you do want those to be beautiful, and that takes then you want to take your time with that. But the structure of the story, you should know what you're using these story structures. That's why I brought it up, is that you can it gives you a better idea of where you're going when you are lost. And a short story doesn't always have to end like, as a novelist, I'm a little heavy-handed with a short story, and I really want to put that nail in it. Bam, 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 bam. Make sure it's really nailed down. Whereas a short story, you do want to have a little bit more a lighter hand with the ending. Sometimes just the curtains open and you get a look at the mystery, and then the curtains close. And you have to have some restraint to be able to do that. What do we have? And then anybody has good ideas for if you've seen a new collection of short stories that grab you, put them in the comments, because people are looking for them. There's always more. The one that I've read most, that I've really enjoyed, that I've read within the last couple of years, is this The Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin, which was astonishingly good. Oh my God. But there are a lot of fabulous stories that are out there. One of my students, Olivia Clare, has a wonderful collection of stories. I like, get Best American and read those stories. They're wonderful. But the great classic short story writers, Faulkner was a fabulous short story writer. Of course, Chekhov was fabulous and did not have to write short. I love him. One of my favorites is a book of short stories by Melanie Ray Thon called First, Body. That was glorious. And when I was learning to write, I just would read that over and over again. And then Joyce Carol Oates, The Master. And I would recommend her stories from early collections like Upon the Sweeping Flood, By the North Gate, Goddess and Other Women. The Goddess and Other Women. There are about 5 of them, and I've just read them until the books fell apart. I mean, I have them, but they're like stuffed into the covers. They're the kind of books that writers love to see, that have been absolutely shredded, because we know somebody has really loved those books well. All right. Well, happy Writing Wednesday, and I'll be on time next week. Okay. Bye.